Good morning and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you are probably in the right place. So before we get started, I would like to make an announcement. So we meet every Sunday here at noon, so we'll see you next Sunday. But June 16th, I want to call your attention that we have a special guest, Sarah Hayter, who started an advocacy group for ex-Muslims, for ex-Muslims to find support and to normalize a religious dissent within their community. All right, so our members ourselves give the talks, and then afterwards we get into a discussion circle. So looking forward to today's talk. If you would like to donate to cover the cost of renting the rooms, there's a donation jar, and there's also, you can donate off seattleatheist.church. So without further ado, come on.
All right, is everyone awake?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you sure? Okay, so I have some bad news for you. So I know you were thinking today you're coming to Seattle Atheist Church, but so sort of bad news, good news. Actually, you guys don't know it, but for the last 20 years, you've been in a maximum security prison. Sorry, really bad news, maximum security prison. So the lawyers make us do this. Every 10 years, we have to wake all of you guys up, and we have to ask you a question. We have to ask you, do you want to continue to live in this virtual reality that we've created for you? So we're in the future. We're very humane in the future. And in the future, we don't just stick people in the 6x8 cell and have you eat porridge all day, although you can if you choose. What we do is we have a virtual reality that we can plug you into. And that way you can experience whatever life you want. And we have a fantastic selection that you can select from today. You can, if you want to, you could decide to be a great actress. You could decide to be a famous poet, or even the President of the United States. It's all up to you. We have all these different programs. And you can select whichever program you want. We'll plug you into the machine, and we'll make you forget this part. You won't remember this at all, the selection, and you'll just believe that you're whoever you pick for another 10 years, and then we have to wake you up again. So, sorry about the bad news. I want to start by, so you have a choice. You can either go back and experience the world as it actually is, and go back to your 6x8 prison cell and experience the real world, or you can be plugged back into our virtual reality machine, our experience machine. So just out of curiosity, how many people want to exit the program at this point? We got, we got some people. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, okay. Like
prison program or
I'm sorry. So how many, yes, excellent question. It's good to be clear about these things. So the question is, I guess the question is, how many people want to be unplugged from the machine, go back to their 6x8 cell, and eat porridge 3 times a day for the next 10 years? Wow, that was done with enthusiasm. So we got what? Yeah, we still got about half the people. How many of you want to select from, again, we have an excellent selection, select from a nice array of possible lives where you could be, you could be Donald Trump. There you go. You just put your hand back down again. You don't have to breathe back down again. Or you could be, I don't know, a famous actor or actress or a poet, whatever you want to be. So how many would pick the second?
And can we pick the specific person we want to be?
Absolutely.
Like just being a happy person?
Happy person. Oh, yeah. So we do a lot of research. We don't get any bad people in here. We want it to be an excellent experience.
What if you want to be a bad person?
No, sorry. That's how you got in jail in the first place. So, no. Okay. So, that's great. let's simplify this a little more. How many of you have seen the Woody Allen movie Sleeper? Just out of curiosity. Oh, a lot of people have. Hey, it came out like, what was it, 1974. That was a long time ago. In the movie Sleeper, you'll remember the Orgasmotron. Does everyone remember the Orgasmotron? Okay, so the Orgasmotron is this great device. You walk through it, you just experience intense pleasure. So I'm just going to make it simpler. Instead of having to pick like being the president or having to pick to be an actor or an actress or something like that, let's just make it really simple. Apple, it turns out, is coming out with an Orgasmotron now. They're calling it the iOrgasmotron, and you buy it, and once you enter that, it's a big cylinder. You walk into it and just have intense pleasure. And it turns out, it has a feeding tube. You can just live in there for the rest of your life. Just in the Orgasmotron. It's fantastic. So let's make this simpler. Instead of having to, the nitty-gritty details of being an actor or an actress or who cares, why not just cut to the chase, stick you in an Orgasmotron for the next 10 years? Who wants to enter the Orgasmotron? Okay, there we go. Thank you. I appreciate it.
They charge your dopamine or whatever.
What's that?
Too much of a good thing.
Oh, no. They worked it out. Those engineers at Apple, it's just
euphoria.
Constant Orgasmotron. Yeah, there's no downside, no negative effect. Just they plug you in. We got another convert. That's great. We got two. Yeah, it's good you checked into the details.
I want more Apple stock, though.
Well, yeah. That's right.
I want to know when it's...
Right. Yeah, buy Apple stock right before they release it. Yeah, that's a good idea. So just to point out, Jeremy Bentham, who is, by the way, the father of utilitarianism, he writes in the opening sentences of his book, he writes, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we should do." So it sounds very much as if Bentham is saying, hey, if you're given that choice, you guys are making the right choice. Enter the Orgasmotron. It's all about maximizing pleasure. We have here a simple device that allows you to maximize pleasure. So, what's the argumentation here? Why would you not choose the thing that could give you intense and constant pleasure for the rest of your life? Seems like a simple decision. This whole discussion about thinking in terms of living in a virtual world or having an experience machine or working with a Orgasmotron was really made famous. I mean, there's a long tradition in science fiction stories about this, science fiction movies, there's a lot of examples of that. But in the philosophical literature, these questions became famous from Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And that book came out in 1974. And so in that book, that's where he presents this idea of an experience machine. This machine that you can plug into and lead a completely happy life from your perspective, from the inside. You can plug in, and he asks the question, well, given the choice, why not just do that? Why not just experience a super happy life instead of being unplugged and living in the world as it actually is? And the reason he raises this question is, let me quote him, he wants to answer the question, what else can matter to us other than how our lives feel from the inside? That's his question. What else can matter to us other than how our lives feel from the inside? And just want to linger on that question for a moment and try to clarify a little more, because the exact question here is going to be important. But another way of phrasing it is a good life the same as a happy life? In other words, is the most important goal in life happiness? In the narrow case of the Orgasmotron, we're just defining happiness as pleasure. In a more broader sort of definition of happiness, you can think of Robert Nozick's experience machine, where you have a variety of different experiences that all amount to happiness, right? But they're really asking the same question. In a later book, Robert Nozick writes, this is a really great book, by the way, called The Examined Life, that he wrote in the 1980s. He writes, some theorists have claimed that happiness is the only important thing about life. All that should matter to a person, they say, is being happy. The sole standard for assessing a life is amount or quantity of happiness it contains. So the whole point of Robert Nozick's thought experiment is to challenge this assumption, to challenge the idea that the only thing to leading a good life is happiness. That's what he's after with this thought experiment. Now, of course, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of alternative versions of this thought experiment, both in film and fiction and in the philosophical literature. The most famous one being, of course, The Matrix. Come on, we've all seen The Matrix. I love the scene in The Matrix. Remember Cypher sitting in his simulated restaurant? He's sitting there. I got to give you his quote. I love that quote from The Matrix. He says, I can't do his accent. I wish I could do his New York accent and give you the full Cypher thing. So you just have to pretend, you're hearing this. I know this steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that's juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what? You know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss. And so, remember the deal he makes in The Matrix is they'll make him forget he's actually in the Matrix again. And then he gets to enjoy his steaks, and they're going to give him a really fancy life afterwards. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. How many people have seen that movie? I love that movie. That's a great movie. It's also a variation on this thing. You remember what happens in that movie is that, as Jim Carrey, Kate Winslet, their relationship goes bad. They both decide they're going to erase each other from their memories. So they're actually actively deluding themselves about their previous life so that they think it will make them happier. So they'll disconnect themselves from their actual memories so that they'll have a happier life. And then finally, this is a related story. It's not quite the same as the other stories, but in some ways it's more realistic. The related story is, let me lay it out for you. Imagine there's an old man. It's in the 1940s. There's an old man, and his son is drafted into war. So he's sent off, to fight in Germany. And you're a friend of this old man. You live in the same building. And you see one day he gets a letter back from the government. And you intercept this letter and it says, I'm sorry, your son has died a horrible death, mustard gas, really painful. It was awful. And if you gave that letter to the old man, that would cause him to suffer for the rest of his life. He would for the remainder of his life, he would be, tormented by the fact that his son went off for war and had this horrible death. So you make a decision. You have to decide whether you want to substitute another letter in. And the letter that you want to substitute in, you can say, hey, Dad, I met this, girl in France, and I've moved to Paris. I'm sorry I'll never come back to the United States again. Probably won't write to you a bunch, but I'm going to go off and live a happy life for the rest of my life. And so you have a choice there. You can substitute that letter in. Just out of curiosity, how many people would give the government letter to the father of the son, the one that tells what actually happened? Wow, just about all of you. You guys are so honest. I'm impressed. How many of you would substitute in the lie to make the father happy? One person. Good for you. I like that. Okay. All right. So, and of course, in some ways, the story of the father and the son is very close to the invention of heaven, right? Where people tell people, immediately, you probably experience this when you have a family member die, or people immediately say, it's okay, they're off someplace else right now, they're happy, you'll rejoin them later on. Very similar story, right? Something to reassure people about the person still being alive someplace. Because it's very reassuring to people to believe that. All right. So there's a lot of variations of this experiment, but the basic idea is that in one way or another, you are deluding yourself by changing your subjective experience of the world so that you believe that something is true that's not true, but it results in you being happier. And so the question is, well, what's wrong with that? So Nozick has 3 arguments against the experience machine. So he first, I want to point out that Nozick assumes that anyone faced with the decision between living the life of the experience machine and living in the real world would pick the real world. He assumes that. He writes in his book, The Examined Life, we care about more than just how things feel to us from the inside. There is more to life than feeling happy. We care about what is actually the case. We want certain situations we value, prize, and think important to actually hold and be so. We want our beliefs, or certain of them, to be true and accurate. We want our emotions, or certain important ones, to be based upon facts that hold and to be fitting. We want to be importantly connected to reality, not to live in a delusion. That's what he writes. And he has 3 arguments for why he thinks people reject this idea of plugging back into the experience machine. Argument number one, first we want to do certain things and not just have the experience of doing them. So we want to actually do them instead of having the experience of doing them. Number two, a second reason for not plugging in is that we want to be a certain way, to be a certain person, sort of person. Someone floating in a tank is an indeterminate blob. That's what he writes. And he goes on in this section to say, they don't really feel courage, they don't feel all the emotions that we do, they only have assimilation of those emotions. So they're not really a human being. And then finally he says, plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality, to a world no deeper or more important than what people can construct. So it limits sort of our possibility of experience. So I just want to say here, I don't find Nozick's arguments very convincing. I just want to push back for two reasons. Number one, you got to remember that he wrote this back in the 1970s. So all of you guys grew up on Minecraft, so you spent a huge amount of your life, or I know my children have, in a virtual reality. So they're already very used to interacting in a virtual reality. You have World of Warcraft, Halo, all those things. You've already lived in these virtual realities. So I think you probably have a deeper understanding of what it's like to live in a virtual world than Nozick does. And I would challenge Nozick on the idea that people can't exhibit bravery in a virtual world, or they can't have fear. I get pretty scared when those Halo monsters run at me, I gotta tell you. And I think, those are things that you can experience even when you know that they're not even true. I mean, that's even true for a television show, right? Watching, I don't know, whatever show, you get caught into the emotions of the characters, and it is a form of virtual reality, much lighter than the one that they're talking about, the experience machine, but we can have emotions in those situations. And number two, it turns out that people have done now empirical studies on Nozick's experience machine. They've actually done large surveys of people, sort of like what I did at the beginning, to find out how many people would pick the experience machine over being, say, in a maximum security prison. It turns out that about 87% of people would choose the experience machine. So it's very highly, you can control it by how you frame it. You can very heavily control it. There's something called status quo bias. So if you don't frame it in the right way, then people are afraid of losing the status quo, so that changes the numbers. There's also people who give different answers depending on whether you're talking about putting yourself in an experience machine or putting someone else. So I very carefully, like the old man story, talked about someone who wasn't myself, so you're not deluding yourself, you're actually helping someone else be happier. So that also seems to matter. So there's things you can play with to make people come up with different answers when you ask them this question. All right, so although I don't find Nozick's arguments very convincing, I think his overall claim is right. And Nozick writes, the question of whether to plug into this experience machine is a question of value. The question is not whether plugging in is preferable to extremely dire alternatives, lives of torture, for instance, but whether plugging in would constitute the very best life or tie for being best, because all that matters about a life is how it feels from the inside. In other words, it all comes down to experience and happiness. And so I think when you're considering the experience machine, it's important to distinguish two questions. There's the descriptive question of what people would actually choose. And then there's the normative question that concerns what people should choose in those situations. And those are very different things. So doing a survey really, in some sense, doesn't answer the philosophical question about what you should do. It only answers the question of what people actually select. Cypher, for example, again, the Matrix, is very happy to eat assimilated steaks, but we don't really admire Cypher. We think he's morally defective and shallow, right? He's not something we actually look up to as a role model in life, or I hope not many of you do, remembering Cypher. Okay, so another way to think of these questions about the experience machine is to think about what happens to projects that you care about or people that you care about after you die. And the reason I'm bringing up this example is this is a very clear, before you die, you have mental states, you have experiences of the world, you can feel happiness or lack of happiness. After you die, you definitely can no longer have mental states and have experiences of happiness or no happiness. And I just want to point out that, if your only goal in life is to experience happiness, then strictly speaking, you shouldn't care about anything after you die, right? Because if you really define happiness as a mental state of some sort of mental state of pleasure, then who cares? If I discover I have terminal cancer, I'm going to die in 6 months, then strictly speaking, I shouldn't care about anything that happens after those 6 months because they can no longer directly affect my mental states. But that's not true. It's not true of most humans, right? For example, people really care about the people they love. I care very much what happens to my wife or my children after I die. I want to make sure they're happy, and that matters to me. And it doesn't only matter while I'm alive that I think that they'll be happy when I die. I really want them to be happy after I die, and I think that's an important distinction. People also care very much about the projects they're engaged in. If I was an author, I've spent 10 years writing this brilliant book, and I care about whether people read this book after I die. Even if I'm not around to bask in all the fame, I can't show up on the talk shows, I still, very much want people to think I wrote a great book. Finally, people care about causes, global warming, climate change. Hopefully, you're not saying, well, the moment I die, who cares? It doesn't affect my experiences anymore. You care about what happens to climate change because you care about what happens in the world even after you die. All right, so let's return to the example of the father of the son who was killed in the war. Do you really think the right thing is to deceive the father into believing that the son is still alive and living a happy life in Paris? The reason that I feel uncomfortable, I feel uneasy thinking of this particular example is because it seems very similar to Cypher's fake life eating simulated steaks. We're inflicting on someone else, we're making the person live in an illusion. The emotions that the father and Cypher both experience seem unwarranted. Thinking of the father, contemplating with happiness the fact that his son is off enjoying Paris, that emotion seems unwarranted. And that's why we feel that there's something off there. And so one thing we've discussed in previous talks in the church, emotions are the types of things that can be warranted or unwarranted. You can have a warranted fear or you can have an unwarranted fear. A good example is a friend of mine is very afraid of beetles. They see a beetle, they go running away in fear. I think they think they're poisonous. I don't know what they think the little beetle's going to do to them. But that's a completely unwarranted fear, right? Beetles are not dangerous, insects. Now, black widow spiders, sure, I understand that. Beetles, no. Beetles are our friend. So that's an unwarranted fear. Happiness can also be a warranted or unwarranted emotion. In the case of Cypher, him feeling all that pleasure from eating steak, or in the case of the father pondering the fact that his son is off living a happy life in Paris, that's an unwarranted emotion of happiness. So that's why we feel uncomfortable. We feel uncomfortable about the person experiencing those emotions. Okay, and what follows from that is if it's true that our inner mental states does not determine whether we're having a good life or a bad life, then what follows from that is you might not be the best judge of whether you're leading a good life. If happiness is your only sort of indicator, your gauge of success in life, and that gauge might be defective, then one thing that follows from it is from an internal point of view, that might not be the best point of view to determine whether you're leading a good life. Imagine two artists. This is actually an example that comes from Nozick's Examined Life. One artist paints really ugly paintings, but he has a trust fund, he has tons of money, all of his friends are always being nice to him, they're always saying, oh, what a beautiful painting you've done. Oh, another masterpiece you've created today. So he thinks he's creating these just incredible artwork all the time, he's getting praise for it. And so he feels very happy, but it's unjustified happiness. And then there's another painter who is just, actually creating masterpieces. But this painter is surrounded by unsophisticated art critics. And they all say everything he draws is just ugly. And so he lives a whole life of shame over this horrible artwork, of depression and sadness. So clearly, it seems strange to say that a person can't be the best judge of their own life. But in a certain way, if we're judging the quality of the two painters' life, it's tempting to say that, the painter who's actually creating fantastic artwork but isn't aware of it and is feeling sad is actually leading in some ways a better and more quality life than the painter who's creating, art that he only thinks is beautiful art. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me come to the conclusion. So the goal of this talk was to answer the question, what makes a good life? That's really the point of the talk. In particular, I wanted to answer the question, is a good life the same as a happy life? Are those the same thing? Robert Nozick's thought experiment, the experience machine, makes us question whether a happy life is the same as a good life. We can imagine many situations in which a person is happy, but that happiness is not warranted, and we conclude that the person is not leading a good life. So, let me answer the question that started this talk. Why not spend your life in Orgasmotron? Because while a life spent in an Orgasmotron would be a happy life, it would not be a good life. You're not necessarily the best judge of your own life. Let's discuss.